Right. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming along to this session of the British Association for Psychological Types 33rd Annual Conference. I'm delighted and honoured actually to be introducing this keynote speech by James Johnston. It's the first time James has been at a British Association conference, so it's a first for him and for us. James is an expert in psychological type, and he teaches at the Carl Jung Institute in Zurich. He's also the founder of Gifts Compass, which is a self-assessment based on Jung's original 8 psychological types. He's the author of this wonderful book, Jung's Indispensable Compass, which you can see on the slide here. And I can definitely recommend it. I bought it some months ago when I first met James and read it, and there's so much in it. It's an amazing book. So yeah, delighted to welcome James, and really, James, over to you. We're excited to hear what you've got to share with us.
Okay, thanks so much, Catherine. And it's a real privilege to be here. I very much appreciate the opportunity. Let me sort of take you through how the hour is going to go. This is what you might have seen, and this is what we'll try to stick to. We'll be talking about the pandemic, enabling the introverted orientations. We'll be considering each of Jung's original 4 introverted type orientations and how the pandemic may have enhanced their value for living a newer, deeper, more spiritually and morally grounded life in the world. We'll do the webinar in 3 parts. And the first part I would call the theater of individuation, or Jung's architecture of the psyche. So this will be a brief review of a diagram that he offered in his 1925 seminars that sort of encapsulates his whole model of analytical psychology. That might be new for a number of people on the call, and so we'll have a brief Q&A following that part of the webinar, and then we'll go to what I would call the compass of consciousness, Jung's type model depicted as a compass, which is how he seemed to be using his psychological type model. We'll do another Q&A after that part, because that also might be new for a number of people on the call. And then finally, we'll get to those 4 introverted types and have a closer look at their attributes and how they might have contributed to our lives or the life of our culture and civilization in general as a result of the pandemic. So let's start with this theater of individuation. And by the way, the Q&A for the first 2 parts, I'd prefer to keep those to written questions. We'll try to keep these questions and answers condensed after these 2 initial parts, and then we'll just open it for general questions and answers after we go through the 3rd part. So the first part, I'm trained as an architect, and when I saw Jung's diagram of the architecture of the psyche, it struck me immediately as looking like a floor plan. I saw it as a sort of a theater in the round. And his architecture of the psyche starts where any other psychological paradigm starts. It starts with an observing I. In German, it's Ich. Translated to English, it became ego, which is the Latin term for I. It's an observing I in relation to what Jung called the outer object, or the world at large. So this is a paradigm that's probably shared by every other model of psychology that we might consider. The problem with this is that it's also the model for any raccoon, squirrel, or chicken. And what we need is a model that articulates the human experience. So Jung noted that there's a second object to which we are also oriented. And that he called the inner object, also known as the archetypal collective unconscious. So the ego is also aware of this inner object, these images from the archetypal unconscious. Well, what is the archetypal unconscious? What are the archetypes? We could spend probably 5 seminars just considering the archetypes themselves. So let's simplify our understanding of the archetypes. At their basic level, they are essentially the foundations for consciousness itself. Here Jung says the form of the world into which he is born is already inborn in him as a virtual image. Likewise, parents, wife, children, birth, and death are inborn in him as virtual images, as psychic aptitudes. So that's one side of the archetypes. They act like Kant's categories or Plato's ideas. They form the pattern and of understanding for experiencing the world as people. There's another aspect of the archetypes, and that's the one we're going to be pursuing today. And he uses Schopenhauer to help explicate this aspect of the archetypes. He says, or Schopenhauer is actually being quoted here, the image or the images are like a living, self-developing organism endowed with generative power, constantly bringing forth something that was not put into it. So these images offer views of the world that give life new potential, new meaning, and new purpose. They are the images that can advance life, both for the individual and for the community. What's it like to perceive these inner objects? What's it like to perceive them vis-a-vis our experience with the outer world? Well, we could use a couple of artists to help illustrate the difference. In terms of perceiving the outer object, we could consider Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. Very clear, very crisp, very tangible. You could almost reach out and touch this girl. It's so clearly defined with detail. The images of the archetypes in the inner life are entirely different, and it's very difficult to articulate them, but we might use Chagall's painting to help understand the nature of those images. They live in a space that in a way is outside the frameworks of time and space. They don't tend to have dimension. They don't tend to have the attributes of the outer object. And so because our perceptions of the outer object versus the inner object are so different, we'll use a couple of different terms to describe our relationship to both objects. In the case of the outer object, we'll use the term perceive. In the case of the inner object, we'll use the term apprehend. It's a different kind of perception that's occurring there. So we want to give it a different name. So with that in mind, let's complete the rest of the architecture of the psyche as Jung depicted it in his 1925 seminars. So you might be familiar with the term persona, directly attached to the ego, really. We know that the ego has type disposition preferences typically. Let's say this ego leads with extroverted thinking. To the degree that the ego is leading with extroverted thinking, the persona will also have an extroverted thinking quality about it. The persona is sort of the social mask in a way that we wear as we engage with the world out there. On the other side of the psyche, and this is one of the things that I liked about Jung's architecture as an architect myself, that there's a symmetry to his architecture. There's a complementarity that exists. We have on the other side, on the unconscious side of the psyche, we have the shadow and soul, complements to the ego and the persona. So if the ego has adopted an extroverted thinking modality, whatever it has not adopted will be sort of displaced into the shadow. And so theoretically, if it's extroverted thinking out here, it would be introverted feeling leading for the shadow. And just as the ego and persona are sort of attached typologically, the shadow and soul are also attached that way. So the soul also adopts an introverted feeling kind of disposition. And over the course of life, where life is being lived out here on the conscious side of the stage, interacting with the unconscious side of the stage, there develops what Jung called the personal unconscious. That's this band here in the middle. And it's full of complexes, it's full of memories, it's full of emotional content. And so on this theater, or on this stage, this architecture of the psyche, where do we find psychological types? Well, clearly we find psychological types out here in ego consciousness. The ego will adopt certain preferences or dispositions related to psychological types, as will the persona. But we'll also find psychological types on the unconscious side of the psyche, in the shadow and soul. And so there is a dynamic opposition that occurs between the conscious side and the unconscious side of the psyche. Well, what's missing on this diagram? What we're missing is the person. Where is the person, or the personality, the greater personality occurring in this diagram? Because we're seeing sort of personalities occurring already in the ego and persona. We're seeing sort of personalities occurring in the shadow and the soul. Where is the person located on this diagram in Jung's model? Well, for Jung, the personality is preeminent. It's preeminently important. Individuation is probably the centerpiece of his whole model of analytical psychology. And individuation for Jung is the individuation of the unique individual person. He says individuation, therefore, is a process of differentiation, having as its goal the development of the individual personality. So where do we find in this model personality occurring? For Jung, it's occurring in the center. This something is the desired midpoint of the personality, the coming to birth of personality, a profoundly individual step forward, the next stage. So the individual personality is really different from the persona, the ego, the shadow, the soul. It is that individual that is unifying both sides of the psyche. So in Jung's model, the individual personality is born as the ego persona dispositions are integrated and united with the shadow soul dispositions. And it doesn't occur overnight. Personality, Jung said, is a seed that can only develop by slow stages throughout life. It's a developmental process, and individuation is perpetual and lifelong. But this development of the individual personality is preeminently important in Jung's model of analytical psychology. He noted that to the extent that one is untrue to the law of his being and does not rise to personality, he has failed to realize his life's meaning. So let's pause here for a moment. I'm imagining that some or all of this might be somewhat new for people on the call. Let's see if we have any questions in chat that we need to resolve before moving forward.
Okay, thanks, James. So yes, so if you have any questions, if you could pop them into chat, and I'll read them out for James to answer. what James has just been talking about is actually in his book that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's so good to have it refreshed and explained verbally rather than just reading about it. So I just found that explanation really, really helpful.
Good.
But now is your chance, anybody, to put anything into chat if you want any clarification before we move on. Right, so we have a question, James. Yeah, where does the inferior function fit on this model?
Yeah, the inferior function would be embedded here in the shadow. That would be, you know, there are 4 functions, as we'll talk about in the next section, but there are 4 functions and 8 function attitudes or cognitive processes. But the inferior function, as Jung talks about it, is virtually synonymous with the shadow.
Great, thank you.
Okay, good.
No other questions, so I suggest we move on, James, in the interest of, yeah.
All right, excellent. All right, so let's turn to the pandemic for a moment and consider what happened in terms of psychological type during the pandemic. So we know from Jung's model that the inner object, the images of the archetypes, will be just as important as anything going on in the world in terms of developing the individual personality, in terms of this process of individuation. And in highly extroverted cultures, like the one we have over here in the United States, and my sense is also like the one you have in the UK, the inner object, the more introverted side of the psyche, tends to kind of lose out to all of the energy and activity occurring on the extroverted side. And so what the pandemic enabled was for that highly active, noisy, colorful, extroverted side, it kind of went quiet and kind of went dark. And so we've in the pandemic, we've gotten respite from what might have been culturally a one-sided extroversion. And Jung notes that to the degree that we're one-sided, we're one-sided to any particular extreme, we're generating neuroses for ourselves. So if we're one-sided towards the extroverted side of life, the compensation for that will be to develop the introverted side of life. And so during the pandemic, the outer object went quiet, the streets went quiet, the shops were closed, transportation went down. And with that, if there's no outer object to relate to, there's no need for a persona relating to it. So what we're left with is an orientation just to the inner object. And Jung says of a highly introverted individual that his ideal is a lonely island where nothing moves except what he permits to move. So in a way, we were thrust onto that island with the pandemic. So our focus now will be to consider the value of having been able to focus more on the introverted side of life. And to do that, I'd like to develop Jung's, what I call the type compass. He considered psychological types to be a kind of compass that was useful to him, both on the conscious side of the psyche and also the unconscious side of the psyche. And he said, I would not for anything dispense with this compass on my psychological voyages of discovery. So let's take a look at what that compass might look like, so we have a better understanding of these introverted orientations, and then we'll take a look at the introverted orientations themselves. So we'll develop this compass as a compass of ego consciousness. It's the easiest way for us all to understand that compass. And fortunately, we don't have to deal with the extroverted side of the psyche so much, because our focus will be on the introverted side. So here's that small compass. Let's elevate it to a larger scale. So we have the inner object here, the outer object there. We have two of the functions that are probably familiar to us all. N for intuition, S for sensation. Intuition's role is to relate to the inner object. Sensation's role is to relate to the outer object. To better understand the functions and what I call the types that are born from them, we need to understand two key definitions in Jung's model. The first is for the term attitude. So for Jung, attitude is a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. And the second term that we need to understand in this inquiry is the term orientation. He says, I use the term to denote the general principle governing an attitude. So how does that apply to our two perceiving functions here? Well, intuition has an attitude that is ready to receive its orientation. So intuition has an attitude that's ready to receive the inner object, the images of the archetypal unconscious. Sensation has an attitude that is a readiness to receive the perceptions of everything going on in the world. So functions also have attitudes and orientations, as do introversion and extroversion, as we'll see in a minute. We have two other functions, of course, that we want to add to this compass. There's the thinking and feeling functions. Thinking will have an attitude that is oriented to its governing principle of logic. So thinking will have a readiness to apply logic to whatever it is attending to. The feeling function will have a readiness to apply value in the same way that thinking is applying logic. And Jung noted that these two, he called these rational functions, and he called these two irrational functions. I've used the term receptive rather than irrational, because it better describes what those functions are actually doing. So we have the four functions on this compass, but now we need to add libido, or what we all know to be extroversion and introversion. So extroversion is an outward turning of libido. Introversion is an inward turning of libido. So you can imagine that for each of these four functions, we can think of libido almost as a wind that blows by and moves each of these four functions either out to the outer object or inward to the inner object. And when it does that, it will be combining its libido attitude with the functional attitude of the four functions. So libido, or introversion and extroversion, are commonly known as attitudes. The introversion attitude has a readiness to apply its energy toward the inner object, its governing principle. The extroverted energy has a readiness to apply its energy toward the outer object, its governing principle. So let's look at what that does for our compass. And in this way, we'll create a compass with all 8 types or all 8 cognitive processes, depending on how you want to characterize them. So let's take the extroverted libido first. We get 4 extroverted types out of the movement of that energy towards the outer object. And what happens is the functional attitude and orientations merge with this directional attitude and orientation that's embedded in the libido energy itself. So extroverted thinking will be a commingling of an orientation towards logic and applying logic with the orientation towards the outer object. So using extroverted thinking as our example, logic will be applied to the stuff of the world. In the same way, feeling will apply value to what's being experienced out in the world. And the extroverted types are actually a little bit easier to understand than the introverted types because it's more of an additive process. But in each case, there's a third being born. There's a new orientation being born with extroverted thinking. There's a new orientation being born with extroverted feeling. It's a commingling. It's a merger of value and the outer object, or logic and the outer object. But our focus today is not on the extroverted types because during the pandemic, they were not especially useful to us. Our focus will be on the introverted side of this compass. So we let the introverted libido arrive and create the third, the merger of each of the functions with the libido energy, creating the third attitude and orientation that will produce the four introverted types. So the introverted types are oriented to this mythopoetic, imaginal side of the psyche, to images that represent possible views of the world, which give life a new potential. We'll have introverted thinking. It will be the commingled orientation of logic as it is applied to these images of the archetypes. So introverted thinking will acquire a new orientation. Introverted feeling will do the same. Introverted sensation, probably the most difficult of the 8 types to fully understand, will be a commingling of the perceptions of the outer object with the images of the inner object. And then finally, introverted intuition, which is completely and wholly oriented to the inner object, both in terms of its directional libido and in terms of its functional orientation. Let's pause here. This compass idea might be new to a lot of people. Do we have any questions about the compass before we move into looking at each of these 4 introverted dispositions in greater detail?
There was one question posted, James, which may have since been answered since you talked about the libido. But before you talked about the libido, there was a question about, are you saying that intuition is always inner and sensing is always inner? Or was it just in that example you were talking about?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when people say, oh, he's a sensation type, they're almost always referring to extroverted sensation. When sensation, which is oriented to the outer object, is blown inwardly by this introverted libido, it takes on attributes that are entirely different from its extroverted sensation compatriot to the south. And it actually becomes very close to introverted intuition. So I'm not saying that intuition is always introverted. In fact, intuition will also be extroverted when that extroverted libido blows by. We'll have an extroverted intuition out here. So intuition and sensation each as functions can go both ways, introverted or extroverted.
Okay, and there's another couple of questions come in, yep, which shows how fascinating and this presentation is. So one question, is EN a combination which is kind of conflicted, an inward function directed outwardly?
Yes, yeah, I call introverted sensation and extroverted intuition the crossover types, because they're changing their orientations. Intuition starts with an orientation to the images of the archetypes and ends predominantly with an orientation to the outer object, to the world. So there is a sort of inherent conflict in a way within the type itself. But on the other hand, they become, those 2 types in particular become very adaptable. They can collaborate on either side of the psyche, with the introverted types or the extroverted types.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then there's another question. Could you clarify the difference between attitude and orientation? Because the
Yes.
person posing the question says, you know, she tends to, and I often tend to use them as synonyms.
Yeah.
So what is the difference?
Well, so let's use the thinking function as our example. The thinking function will have an attitude, and its attitude is a readiness to apply its orientation, which is logic. So the attitude is a readiness to apply something, in this case, logic. Logic is that attitude's orientation. Orientation is the governing principle for that attitude. So thinking will always and everywhere only apply logic. That's its only function. So logic is its orientation, and its attitude is its readiness to apply that orientation, in this case, logic.
Mm.
It's a sort of nuanced difference, but an important one.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions at the moment, James.
Okay, good. So let's move on to take a closer look at each of these 4 introverted types. I think we can move through this fairly quickly so that we can open it up for questions after we go through this. I hope this will give you a pretty good working sense for each of the 4 introverted types and the contributions that they might have made to us individually or to the culture as a whole. So I mentioned that there's a third being born. So there's a new third merged attitude and orientation that we could characterize as intensively apprehending holistic insights and ideas. In this merger, the introverted attitude tends to prevail in terms of the definition of that final third. So intensive and holistic are terms that we're going to see for all 4 of the types. We've taken the liberty to go beyond calling it just introverted thinking. We've developed some terms that help people who maybe aren't familiar with psychological type to better understand what kind of thinking is actually going on. So we call this conceptual thinking. It's really quite different from the sort of concrete, constructive, programmatic thinking that's going on with extroverted thinking. So let's see what Carl Jung has to say about this type, and he has quite a lot to say. This is, of course, simply a brief excerpt, but he says it formulates questions and creates theories. It opens up new prospects and insights. But with regard to facts, which would be in the outer object, its attitude is one of reserve. Facts, outer object, are of secondary importance for this kind of thinking. What seems of paramount importance is the development and presentation of the initial symbolic image hovering darkly before the mind's eye. So fully oriented to these images of the inner object or the archetypes of the collective unconscious. It might help to assign people to this type, people that we might know. And I've chosen Alfred North Whitehead and Alfred Russel Wallace as representatives, not to say that they were introverted thinking types. I have no idea, but clearly introverted thinking was manifested in the lives that they lived and what they produced. So Whitehead, of course, the great mathematician and philosopher. Wallace might not be as well known. He's actually the co-author of the theory of evolution. Darwin, who is one of Jung's examples of extroverted thinking, was busy for 20 years, acquiring artifacts and fossils to make sense of the history of evolution. Wallace was ill in the Malay archipelago as a naturalist and was sort of stuck in a hammock for a couple of weeks. And the idea for the theory of evolution came to him. He circumambulated it, as introverted thinking does, and developed that idea into a thesis and wrote it out and sent it back to London, where Darwin got hold of it. And as a consequence, they were both endowed as authors of the theory of evolution. So Wallace is a good example of this kind of thinking. It's highly conceptual. It takes an image from the inner life and goes to work on it. So what's some of the value that we individually might have gotten out of this sort of orientation, or that the culture might have gotten out of it? Well, certainly new original philosophic understandings, approaches to urban design, mathematics, government, anywhere that a systemic and holistic understanding of elements of the world could be enhanced. So in our own lives, that might be a sort of more comprehensive, holistic view of the lives that we're living. Where have we been? Where are we going? Understanding it from that sort of introverted thinking perspective. And we may see fruits of the pandemic in terms of new innovations anywhere that we see a need for a holistic understanding of anything that's going on in the world. Let's turn to our next one. The other rational type, as Jung refers to it, introverted feeling. Here, the third that's born, the new merged attitude and orientation, intensively apprehending holistic values and ideals. And so we've applied an adjective to feeling that helps to characterize this sort of feeling, idealistic feeling, entirely different, really, from the extroverted feeling cousin to the south. These two are opponents in many ways, introverted feeling and extroverted feeling. So let's see what Carl Jung has to say about this one. We'll choose an excerpt from his chapter 10 in volume 6 of the Collected Works. It's continually seeking an image which has no existence in reality, but which it has seen in a kind of vision. It glides unheedingly over all objects that do not fit in with its aim. It strives for inner intensity, for which the outer objects serve at most as a stimulus. The depth of this feeling can only be guessed. It can never be clearly grasped. It makes people silent and difficult to access. Elsewhere, he says that the expression still water runs deep could apply to introverted feeling. Well, let's look for a couple of representatives from the UK, Princess Diana and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. You're probably familiar with both, probably much more familiar with Princess Diana than I am. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, both were actually social activists. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, of course, was also a poet, which is not unusual for introverted feeling. We often find it introverted feeling in literature and poetry and the arts. And she wrote the poem that is probably universally known. It begins, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." A very deep feeling for both of these people. So what's the value to the culture or to our individual lives from these orientations? Well, we could reaffirm what has enduring value for our own life or for the culture, for our inner circle of friends, for our organizations, for the culture at large, for the civilization as a whole. And out of the pandemic, we might see new literature, essays, music, poetry, that which connects us with those values of seemingly eternal importance. Let's look at the next one, which seems to be has been the most difficult type to fully understand. It too has a new merged attitude and orientation. We could say that it intensively apprehends holistic innervation. So innervation is a term that we find, at least in the English translation of Jung's volume 6, Psychological Types. And we could say of this, we could call it aesthetic sensation, because as it turns out, this orientation sort of acquires attributes that create a high sensitivity to aesthetic perceptions. We'll get a better sense of this type when we listen to Carl Jung. And this, I think one way to think of these mergers is to think of atoms combining to form compounds. This one for me comes the closest to the analogy with a water molecule. 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. What do you get when you combine 2 hydrogen atoms, which freely burn, with 1 oxygen atom, which supports combustion? You get water, which extinguishes fire. It's completely unpredictable. And this type also has a quality of unpredictability about it. He says, introverted sensation apprehends the background of the physical world rather than its surface. The decisive thing is not the reality of the object, that is the outer object, but the reality of the subjective factor, that is the inner object, of the primordial images which, in their totality, constitute a psychic mirror world. It is a mirror with the peculiar faculty of reflecting the existing contents of consciousness, not in their known and customary form, but as it were, sub specia aeternitatis, somewhat as a million-year-old consciousness might see them. This is sort of magical, mystical stuff, it seems. He goes on to say, such a consciousness would see the becoming and passing away of things simultaneously with their momentary existence in the present. It would see what was before their becoming and will be after their passing hence. We could say that introverted sensation transmits an image which does not so much reproduce the object as spread over it the patina of age-old subjective experience and the shimmer of events still unborn. The bare sense impression, that is the impression from the outer object, develops in depth amidst the archetypal images. The bare sense impression develops in depth, reaching into both the past and the future. Well, who could we use to exemplify this type? I've chosen J.K. Rowling and the great sculptor Henry Moore. You can almost feel the magical, mystical quality of introverted sensation in her series on Harry Potter. And with Henry Moore, you look at his sculpture and it's as though he sees the object, but he's also experiencing that mirror world of the archetypal images within. So how could this orientation be of use to us or the culture out of the pandemic? Well, we'll see new creative endeavors in our own lives, perhaps linked to the past with that million-year-old consciousness, and also with a high sensitivity to aesthetic qualities. Each of these people, you can sometimes see the introverted sensation aesthetic quality just in the clothes that people wear. And we're looking at two individuals who have a sort of aesthetic sensitivity about them, just in the way that they've chosen the clothes that they're wearing and the way that they dress and present themselves. So the last one is introverted intuition. This is the one that's wholly and completely oriented to the inner object, to the images of the archetypes. Well, we could say that this one intensively apprehends holistic images. And it brings a new function to intuition. Someone asked the question, does intuition go inward or outward? In this case, it's fully inward. We could call it visionary, prophetic. When it goes outward, it's more sort of catalytic. It's more engaged in making things happen, achieving potential in the world. Let's see what Jung has to say. But since these images represent possible views of the world, which may give life a new potential, this function, which to the outside world is the strangest of all, is indispensable to the total psychic economy. That is the total psychic economy of us, of the individual. Introverted intuition is essential for our psychic economy, as is the corresponding human type to the psychic life of people. Had this type not existed, there would have been no prophets in Israel. Well, let's see who we can look to characterize this type in the UK. William Blake is a good example. And in my research preparing for this webinar, I discovered Jean Iris Murdoch. You may know her as a novelist. She was both a novelist and a philosopher. She could have actually represented either introverted thinking or introverted feeling. My sense is that introverted intuition was a sort of hinge for her that enabled her to go in either direction, introverted thinking or introverted feeling. And William Blake, you may know as the great poet and artist, one of the greatest artists really to emerge in the Western world. So what are the contributions from the pandemic for this one? Connections with the highly creative images that lead to a profound and sometimes mystical view of life. Images of life on a very grand scale, prophetic images of the future. And highly, highly imaginative. You know, we see introverted intuition at work in very creative efforts as for artists, for novelists, for playwrights, also very active in those arenas. So this is our compass of the introverted types. You may have noticed there are some commonalities as we've gone through these. I mentioned that the libido attitude tends to prevail in terms of the attributes that are built in these third attitude and orientations. For introverted feeling, it was intensively apprehending holistic ideals. For introverted sensation, intensively apprehending holistic innervations. For introverted intuition, intensely apprehending holistic images. For introverted thinking, intensely apprehending holistic ideas. So they become actually quite compatible with one another. And even those functions that begin as opposites end up with a tremendous amount of commonality. Introverted sensation actually begins to look and feel much like introverted intuition. And introverted thinking and introverted feeling, even though they begin as opposite functions, end as relatively compatible rational functions. So that's the presentation. We may not get to all of the questions that you have. If we don't, feel free to contact me. That's my email address, jgjohnston@giftscompass.com. If you want to know more about our work, you could visit our website, giftscompass.com. That's where our training programs are described. The Gifts Compass was really built over the last many years, primarily for depth psychologists and their clients. But one of the fruits of the pandemic for us was the creation of yet another website, Life Atlas. Gifts Compass is really for psychologists and their clients. Life Atlas was designed for everybody else. And so we're quite pleased to have that appear as one of the fruits of the pandemic for us. So let's open it up to questions. Do you want me to continue to share this screen, Catherine, or shall I go to the full?
Good question. No, it's probably easier for you if you don't share the screen.
Okay.
I guess I'm imagining, and I'll pause the recording in a moment. So thank you, James, for that. Lots of food for thought there. I loved the examples of historical people, and as someone who studied English literature at university, I've loved all those real literary figures that you've talked about there. Right, yeah. I'm going to pause the recording